Welcome to Flipping Tables, where we bring all of our religious thinking to Jesus, who flips the table for his upside-down kingdom. I'm Julie Sexton, and I'll be your host. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 38. I have Twila joining me at the table, and we are going to build on a conversation that we had in Episode 36. In that episode, you might remember we talked about a woman named Junia, whom Paul called an apostle in Romans 16. And Junia, she is not the only woman listed in Romans 16. She was one of many. So friends, I think we've been led to misunderstand Paul. We might owe Paul an apology in the future when we meet him, because I don't think Paul was in the business of silencing women. Paul was actually working shoulder to shoulder with women, because Paul, he followed the table-flipping ways of Jesus. Remember in Luke 8, Luke tells us that there were women traveling with Jesus. They were supporting his ministry out of their means. They were women who we can be confident that Jesus treated them as disciples. He taught women, he discussed theology with women, and he lifted women up in his ministry. So if you have a moment, grab your Bible and join us in Romans 16, and you are going to want to have a highlighter in your hand so you can highlight some of these names. So Twila, thank you for letting me interrupt your workday.
You're good.
I just saw you push a little Millie out of the view.
I know. That was when we pre-prayed this episode. That was the one thing I didn't pray for, was cooperation, canine cooperation.
Yes, because we both have like a little sidekick.
Dogs cooperate.
Yes, do it, Jesus. Let the dogs be quiet. Oh gosh, so you've already been out working today?
Yes, working today. Had a early day, as I was telling you, and it's been nonstop. And so I'm really happy for this little pause or break in my day where I can just sit with you and discuss the word. What a gift.
You know, it's like a little midday reset, because we're kind of like recording in the middle of the day. And I think I would love to work that rhythm in my life, to have that morning, midday, and evening. And I think the midday will probably be the hardest one to get into a rhythm of.
Yeah, because you're afraid that once you stop, that like you'll lose the momentum, and that like switching gears, like we just say, oh, one more thing, and one more thing, it's 8:00 at night. So
yeah. So, I mean, you know, a couple of minutes even just to kind of pause, go back to the pause and just reset and think about some people you need to pray for. And you know, it's just a good way to do life, right?
It is.
So we're kind of like setting up this little chapter in Romans, which is kind of an overlooked chapter. It is something that kind of just people just blaze past. But we're going to take a few minutes and we're going to slow down and we're going to think about this chapter and what it actually tells us about Paul. And so we know Romans, very big book, very big letter. So when you think about this letter to Romans, what comes to mind, Twila?
I just think of Paul writing this letter where he really is intentional about summarizing and laying out the gospel. You know, he goes through just every aspect of our human sinfulness, and then our justification by faith and God's goodness and all of the things. And I would say more recently, just because of conversations that we have had, I do think a little bit about the women too.
Yeah. You kind of drawn in and looked at this last chapter and go like, wait a second, this is a really...
to read past and didn't pop off the page necessarily, but just because of the nature of some of our conversations, you know, in the last really couple years, I would say, I notice more when I see the women playing a role. So, yeah.
I think the first time that it really caught my attention was way back early in my walk with the Lord. I was studying Romans in BSF. And when we got to chapter 16, like we covered every part of it. So that's what I noticed. I was like, there's a whole lot of women listed here. And I don't remember like anything except that just made me feel good to see women listed, and that Paul was working with women. So that seed was planted early in really my following Jesus walk. And I'm thankful for that, because as a woman in ministry, called and like yourself, and just that kind of reminds me that keep that in the back of your mind, Julie, because God's got a seat for you at the table. You belong here. He didn't mess up when he was handing out gifts. And that's one of the things that Paul talks about in Romans, because it's one of the places that we can turn to and look at spiritual gifts. And in Romans 12, right after those great verses about being a living sacrifice, Paul goes into talking about gifts of teaching and serving and leading. And it's really, really interesting to me, because sometimes we can easily overlook that there's no distinguishing between who gets what gifts. Paul's just like, here's a whole list of gifts in Romans. Here's a whole list of gifts in Corinthians. And here's a list in Ephesians. Almost forgot where the other list was. But he doesn't say, like, God chooses how to distribute the gifts. So I just think that's so good for us to be reminded of that, and to not let anyone box us in and determine what we can do with those gifts.
For sure.
So this was a really weighty letter that Paul sends a lady named Phoebe to. She goes ahead of him to Rome, because he probably wrote this letter in Corinth, and he had a trip to Jerusalem to make. And he was sending her to Rome to kind of prepare the way for him, because he hoped when he was finished delivering the financial gift to the church in Jerusalem that he would make it on to Rome. And he was kind of counting on Rome to further help him, financially support him, and send him as his next journey. He hoped to go to Spain. We don't know whether he ever made it to Spain, but that was his ambition. He, of course, had a lot of detours on the road to Rome. It took him a long time to get there. So they had a long time to think about everything that he had said to them in that letter. And I'll just let you read those first two verses, and I want you all to realize that when she mentions Phoebe and where Phoebe is from, that's about 9 miles outside of Corinth. So this is where he was writing from.
I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church at Cenchreae, that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and help her in whatever she may need from you, for she has been a patron of many and of myself as well.
Okay, so I don't know what translation you're using, but I'm using the NIV, but I'm glad that you did this, because your translation says that Phoebe was a servant. My translation in the NIV says she was a deacon, and my translation says that she was a benefactor, but yours says she was a patron. Yes. So very cool things that we're going to kind of touch on here. But that word for deacon or servant is this Greek word diakonos. And this word refers to a Christian who is designated to serve with the overseer/elders of the church in a variety of ways. It's actually a word that Paul would use to describe himself. He, in Philippians 1:1, in 1 Corinthians 3:5, and again in 2 Corinthians 3:6. This same word is used to him as a servant. And other places, Paul uses this same word to refer to Timothy, to Tychicus, to Apollos, to Epaphras. He referred to them all as this deacons or servants. But here's the big one. Sometimes he used this word to even describe Christ. Because we know that Christ was a servant, so it's that same Greek word talking about Christ. And even in just the chapter previous, in Romans 15:8, is one of the places where that word is used in reference to Christ. So I think that's really important, because this term is translated as a servant or a minister, and that means it carries that someone is like in a position of authority in a ruling kind of position. So it's important to note that the English translators took that Greek term and they put it in the feminine. They added a little S on it, and so they made it feminine because there was no way that Paul could have been referring to a woman as being in this position of servant, this leadership position. And that has really gone to serve us poorly in the West because it has taken out, it's really cut like the legs out from under it. And so scholars say that we would be correct to conclude that Phoebe had been a minister in that Synchrony church. I love that. And it's empowering to me to read that. Don't you think that's empowering, Twila?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think, and I love what you're talking about, like going back to the original Greek text too, and seeing where all that word was used, the same word used throughout the scripture. I think that's always really important to try to dig in. And the more that I study the word, the more I try to like go, okay, what was the real word and how was it meant, or what were the different ways it could be used? And so I think that's a really important part of our study of the word.
Yeah, I do too. I have lots of questions about why, what caused them to change it into the feminine. Did they do that because they were rooted in patriarchy? What were they doing? Like, what was the purpose of that? So it's in all likelihood that not only did Phoebe deliver this letter, but she probably read the letter to the churches in Rome, going from house church to house church and reading this letter. And I read this, or I heard this, I can't remember which, and I can't remember the source, but it said that Paul had probably coached her in how to read it, where to enunciate, where to hold back, how to do it, to really perform it. And to be able to answer questions, because like when we read Romans, we always have questions. And so she was kind of like their walking commentary. Like Paul would have told her and instructed her to make sure that she could explain justification clearly, that she could explain these very heavy foundational truths to our faith. And I think that is like, you've got a theater background and you're raising a little theater kid. And I mean, that means something to think about it that way.
Yeah. Do you think about the time that goes into rehearsal and the repetition and just everything that goes into it, right? To make sure that it lands right. It's just like, when you think about theater, like you want the line to land right, because it's the difference between either evoking emotion in people or not, or being the punchline that makes everybody laugh or not. And so, yeah, that is really interesting to think about, him working with her and kind of coaching her on the delivery of this message she was bringing.
Well, as you were talking, I remembered where I heard this. It was someone that Annie F. Downs was interviewing on her podcast. And Annie F. Downs has spent like a year reading the Bible. And she talked about how important it was when she was translating she was reading the Gospels. That was her thing. Let's read the Gospels. And she said, I realized that where I put emphasis on words really, really mattered.
Yeah, I think that I heard that same thing. And I feel like maybe I heard the same interview as you, because when you were saying that felt really familiar. But yeah, it does. It matters. And, it's funny is a lot of times when I'm having my quiet time, I prefer to read out loud just because I feel like the words they land differently. They soak in differently.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I'm trying to be so quiet because I don't want anybody to wake up and steal any of my time. But like when I can just read the word out loud, mm-hmm. and sometimes I'll read the same verse or same sentence, a couple of times because I'm like, wow, that just really soaks in and lands differently than when I just silently read.
Yeah, that's what I do too. I either like have it read to me or I read it myself. And right now I'm doing more of reading it myself and reading it out loud to myself. First of all, I love hearing God's word spoken and that it just kind of fills the room and fills the space. It does, and it does hit you differently. Something about hearing it and being able to process it all together. So when we get back to that word benefactor, Paul describes her as a benefactor, and that literally means that she is one who precedes or a woman who is set over others. And okay, this noun in the noun form is only found in this one place in the New Testament. But you can go to writings by Justin Martyr, and you can see that he used it to denote someone presiding over communion. And I loved that because, of course, Twila, you've got to preside over communion in our church and present that. And it was a big step for our church to do that. And I want you to talk about what people have said to you and about how serious you take that role, because I know you take it very serious.
Yeah, I do. I take it very seriously. So it's funny. So the first time I ever, and it was actually, I think before I even did the communion, but even with communion, I didn't realize what a big deal it was. Honestly, I guess that was really naive of me. And instantly, that first week, I was leaving with my family, and I had multiple people, men and women, say, "It was so nice to see a woman up there." Or, "You did such a great job. I was just so happy to see you up there." I was like, wow, I guess this was a bigger deal than I really thought it was. And I continue to get that. Or I'll get people say, "I love it when you're up there," and it's probably just because, I just have a big, joyful personality, or at least I think so.
You do.
And so I think people like the energy that I bring to the stage, right? But then when they started asking me, and so I took that very seriously, just doing announcements and welcoming people, right? And especially once I realized what a big deal this was to some people. But I take the communion piece very seriously. I mean, I will pray the whole week leading up to, like, okay, gosh, God, what do you want me to say about this? What do you want me to tell people about this sacred, holy meal that you invite us into with you, that is, paramount to the representation of our faith, right? And so I take it very seriously, and I will pray about that. And sometimes I panic because I get up to like Saturday morning and I'm like, God, you haven't given me a word yet.
Right.
What are we talking about? But he always shows up. He always gives me a word. And I'll tell you, it's also been really nice because I will get emails from people that will say, "Man, what you said this morning, it spoke to me," or "It was so encouraging to me." And again, I'm always surprised because it never feels like it's some big, really significant thing. We're talking about, like at most a 3 or 4 minute devotion, right?
Right.
But people will say like, "Oh, I was so encouraged by that," or whatever. And so I take it very serious. All of that to say simply. But I've had some people, and I shared this with you recently.
Yeah, I want you to share that.
Yeah, I had a lady that I met, I'd heard of her. And so I was excited. I was like, "Oh, hi. Like, I've heard so much about you. Like, it's great to meet you in person." And she's of an older generation than I am. She's a boomer, but, she said, "Oh, I know who you are. Yeah, you're up on the stage sometimes on Sunday mornings." And she said, "You do a really nice job. I've got to tell you, that was really hard for me at first." I was kind of taken aback because I'm like, this is a woman,
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, "Oh, really? Why is that?" I was just curious, maybe I don't know what I thought it could be. But anyway, she said, "Well, it was just really hard for me to see a woman up there, but I've gotten used to it and I like it now, but it just wasn't easy at first." And so again, like, I didn't realize how big of a deal that would be to some people, but also hearing it from a woman, I guess, was surprising.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. And I actually think that is a very helpful service, that it's very wise of our church to have you. And I think there's another lady who does it sometimes now too. And it just is kind of like preparing the church for, anything that might change in the future. And it's just giving people the time to get used to it, to see, because it is a little jarring. we celebrate it. We're used to it. We see women lead and do things all over the place, but that can be a challenge to some who have been told that, you shouldn't speak in church. If that silencing text in Paul's writings have really been pushed into you, you're like, wait, what's going on? So kind of moving on, I will say that Paul does use the verb form of this word in other places. And one of the places that he uses it is in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 12, where Paul encourages the Thessalonians to respect those over them. And in Romans 12:8, again, back in that passage with the spiritual gifts, he uses it in the verb form to describe the gift of leadership. And something that Nijay Gupta says in Tell Her Story, which I love that book. And again, we've put it in the show notes a couple of times, and we will for this episode again. But he says about Romans 16 that it had been widely neglected in the study of what many consider Paul's most important letter. Kind of takes us back to the top of the conversation where you and I were saying, it's easy just to get to the end of chapter 15 and just go, okay, and he's telling goodbye and move on. But he took verses 3 through 16, a huge chunk, to tell his farewells and to greet people. I don't think that Paul wants us to brush off these greetings like they didn't mean much. And when I think about that scholars have done that, they're like, oh, we don't need to pay any attention to this. There's no real purpose in this. And I'm thinking, that's outrageous. These names, they represent gospel forerunners. These are people who, like forerunners to us, obviously, that are running with the gospel, living out the Great Commission. This is men and women who were serving in hostile times. We should take note and pause over every one of these names because they were putting their lives on the line to spread the gospel, to make disciples. Nijay says that it has been in the last few decades where people have acknowledged that Paul, he constructed his letters from beginning to end. He did it very carefully. And I'm like, I'm so glad that people are speaking up about this. And now we can slow down and pause. I can't think of a single time that I've ever really heard this chapter referenced in a Sunday morning. Obviously, I've heard it talked about in a Bible study fellowship or something where we're very careful to study every word from beginning to end. But Paul, he lists almost 30 individuals, and he does most of them by name. Some of the people, he mentions their households because Paul was in the habit of greeting entire households. But if Paul didn't want us to slow down and pay attention to the names, if he didn't want, when Phoebe was reading this, for those people to hear their names mentioned, he would have just said, greet all God's people, because that's something that he does in other letters. But he goes into these specific names. So we have to ask ourselves why. Why did he do this? And there are some scholars that believe that Paul, he probably had a social agenda built into these greetings because Paul chose to mention the names of these believers of various ethnicities and status levels. He was showing them that they needed to shape their attitude towards Christian ministry and leadership. Because a lot of these names, I'm going to tell you in a few minutes, they embodied what Paul wrote in Romans 3, verses 26 through 28. Twila, can you read it? The Galatians 3, 26 to 28.
Galatians 3, 26 through 28. So in Christ Jesus you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise.
Thanks for reading that. I just think it really captures and shows us that because in this list of names, there are Jews and there are Gentiles and there are people who were because of their name, we can know that they were probably either slaves or they were freedmen. There's males listed, there's females listed. And I think Paul is just trying to paint that picture. Listen, you're all one in Christ. You are all, and this is one of those passages that I go back to that has really served to help me live as a new creation. That the only label that I need to have on myself is that I am a follower of Jesus, or I might call myself an apprentice of Jesus, or I may say that I am, a Christian. I'm a member of his church. I'm a part of his body. I'm using this very inclusive language that I am someone more than a daughter, a mother, a wife, whatever my career is, that I am more than that. And one of the commentators says that Peter Lamp says that there were so many of these names that Paul listed that they had slave origins. And like what I was just saying, like there is this extraordinary number of women. And we're not going to go through all of them in the episode, but because I said I wanted you to highlight them, I'm going to run through some of the names. Besides Phoebe, there was Priscilla, there was Junia, there was Persis, there was Mary, there was Tryphenia, and Tryphus, and Julia, and Nereus' sister, and Rufus's mother. You need to highlight these names in your Bible, maybe in pink, and just like, these are our sisters. These are co-laborers in spreading the gospel. Paul was explicitly commending women's ministry and leadership roles. And perhaps Paul was even encouraging the women who were sitting there to hear those names and be like, there's a call on my life. Like, I've been chosen to run with these women and with these men and make a difference in this place that I live. Isn't that inspiring, Twila?
Yeah, no, I love it. I love just that he, did this public recognition of their value and contribution and faithfulness.
In that last episode that I referenced when Kimberly was here with us and we were all talking, and I had her read that little portion out of the other book that we had read, Warrior of Eden. And so I want to just hit a little bit about some of the stuff that that Nije brings out in his book. And honestly, he quotes some of the same exact stuff that that was quoted in the other book. It's just one of those mic drop kind of things, calling these women, saying that they were more spirited than lions. But when we talked about Mary in that previous episode, I think it's just important for us to see that her name being listed early in the list could imply that she was one of the founding members of the church in Rome. And the amplification that Paul puts on it, that she worked very hard for you, seems to imply, again, that she was a prominent leader in that church. These women were spirited as lions. I'm going to skip down to verse 12, where there's a pair of women, greet Tryphenia and Tryphosa. These women worked hard in the Lord. So again, he's calling them out for working hard. And then he says, greet my dear friend Persis, another woman who has worked hard in the Lord for you. This idea of laboring for ministry implies commitment and courage, resilience, and that they had a deep passion for the gospel. These were women who were putting their life on the line. They could be imprisoned. They could have been, and some of them were imprisoned and put to death. And that just shows us how incredibly powerful that they were. And the enemy was like, we have got to silence these women. We've got to get control of them. And I don't know, I love it. It means a lot to me. It boosts my courage to charge hard and to pursue God's call in my life to make disciples. And one of the things that I was doing last night was I met with a young woman that I mentor, and she lives in our apartments out at the Refuge for Women farm. And I was praying for her at the end of our time together. And this is one of the phrases that I prayed over her. I prayed for her to be as spirited as a lion. And when we finished praying, she said, Miss Julie, it was really interesting that you used that word lion, because I don't know if I told you or if you remember, but I went to church with our friend Abigail recently, and we were just worshiping and, a part of the service. And she said we were walking out, and this man came up to them and he said, I was watching you during worship, and the Lord, he just caused me to notice you. And he pressed upon my heart that he said, this young woman, she is a lion for me. And that meant so much to her. Isn't that beautiful?
That's awesome.
And I think I did know that, but I forgot it when I was praying for her. I was just, pulling from what, this phrase from, how it means so much to me from these books that I'm reading. And I thought that was really amazing.
I love that. The other thing I was thinking as you were talking through this and the jobs that these women did and how we recognize Mary worked very hard for you, is these women weren't just sending the cards, the greeting cards to the sick people and showing up, at the welcome baskets.
Yeah, they weren't just making casseroles.
Oh, that's what I was thinking. It's oh, you mean they weren't just writing the get well soon cards and making welcome baskets. That's so nice.
I was actually talking about some of this.
Against those things because those are all really
wonderful.
And
we do those things, and we
do.
Love
but
to.
We're capable of more.
We are capable of more. I was having this conversation with my daughters earlier in the week, and my oldest one, Shelby, she said, I just have always been so perplexed that we could be mothers to boys, we could teach boys in school, we could do all of these things, but at some point, then we're not allowed to teach them anymore. Why is that?
Wow.
Wow. That was my 24-year-old just calling it like grown up in the church. And she's just like, wait a second. It was okay to do this then, but why can't we do it now, Mom? Why can't? So anyway, it was just the young women among us, they are noticing what they can do. They are paying attention.
They are.
And we don't want them to feel that they are any less than anyone in the body, that we are co-equal. So kind of before we wrap up, I want to say something, because I don't know if I mentioned this when we studied Mark, but in verse 13 of this chapter, Paul says to greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me too. And a lot of speculation goes into, is this the same Rufus that Mark mentioned in Romans, but in Mark 15:21. In Mark 15:21 it says, a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. So obviously, I didn't mention this in the last study of Mark, but many scholars think that this is the same Rufus, that the naming of Alexander and Rufus by Mark seems to imply that these sons of Simon were well known in the early church. And I got to tell you, that just does something for me.
That's incredible.
That is incredible. I remember the first time I learned this, I'm like, that's a complete mic drop. Because, wow. And Paul says about their mother, Simon's wife, that she had been a great help to him, that she had been like a mother to him. And I don't think it's because she was making him casseroles when he came through town. And I was just like, wow, this is a very big statement. And I think it's much more than a cultural relationship. In fact, F.F. Bruce, who is kind of a New Testament scholar of like head of a lot of people, he hypothesizes that Rufus's mother may have provided lodging and hospitality and perhaps even used her wealth or her social connections to aid Paul with perhaps some of, struggles that he had with authorities and like local officials, that she could have been that prominent, that he's like, they would not just be mentioning her because she was nice.
That is really interesting. That is a very interesting take that I've not heard.
Yeah, it's so good. And we're not going to read them, but if you guys want to read in verses 14 through 16, there's this whole list of names. And these are those names that kind of suggest that they were slaves, they were freedmen, they were men, they were women. But again, it's that inclusive language that we're just rattling off the names of the people who were serving and running their race hard. And I was thinking about, I always go back to Jill Briscoe. I loved that time at the If Gathering when someone asked her, when did she receive her calling? And she said, when I got saved. That's when I received my calling. Every believer is called by God. We have all been given gifts and we have all been commissioned. And our mission field, remember she said it was right between our feet. Like that's wherever we're at, that's our mission field. So whatever we are to do is to first and foremost, before we say anything else about us, we are a follower of Jesus, an apprentice of Jesus, however you want to use that language. But the reason I wanted to do this episode with Twila was my aim is to teach us something that isn't normally going to be taught to you on a Sunday morning. And I want to give us a foundation so that when we start the Philippians study, that whole series that we're going to do this fall, I want us to be tuned in to see these women as active members of the church.
Yes, I am really looking forward to that study. I think it's going to be really exciting. I'm already recruiting people to read with me. And so that's going to be great. Well, Julie, thank you for inviting me to the table. It was a good little break in my day. And as always, I think we need to wrap up with a bright spot. What do you think?
Absolutely. We can't leave out our bright spots.
Exactly. Do you want to go first?
Sure, I can. But I think it was just last night. It was just talking to my friend, this young woman, and just seeing her live in her safe apartment, and she's got this sanctuary, and she had all these little, Post-it notes and little reminders, and she had worship music playing in the background. And she said, Miss Julie, I just play worship music all the time because I feel like it just keeps the air clean and full of praise. And I was like, I love that. I'll tell you, you will love this. I showed her the Gather 25 video, and she's like, I have chills, Miss Julie. And she was like tearing up, and she said, I have to do this. And I said, oh, honey, don't you worry. You will do it. I will make sure that you are there. And I said, and we have to recruit all of our other sisters and brothers to come and be a part of this. And she has a fiance in Texas in the military. And she said, I've got to tell Andre. I'm like, yes, you do. Yes, you do.
I love that. Well, that's funny because my bright spot also ties to Gather 25. I think I told you the last time that the three of us were together a few weeks ago, that I was able to reconnect with Ashok, my,
yes.
He's grown now, kid in India.
24.
That I sponsored while he's growing up. And so I sent him the Gather videos, and I was like, hey, I want you to know about this, that this is happening, and it's for the global church. And if there's any way that I can support you being a part of it or help you, I want you to be a part of this. I want to worship and gather with you too. And so, there's always a little bit of a communication break, but it seemed like he was excited. And I was like, if you want to share this with your church, or if you even just want to gather in your home with some friends or family in your village, whatever, I will do whatever I can to help you make it happen. And it seemed like he was excited. So that was cool. And then also when it was all launching, they asked all of us to post a bunch. And so I was blowing up my social media that Tuesday with it. And on Facebook, I tagged some people that I knew that were in ministry but maybe lived in other places in the country that I don't really talk to on the regular. But there's a guy that I went to high school with, and I knew that he was a pastor up in the Cincinnati area. Probably had not spoken to him, like actually spoken, since we were in school together, which was like a bazillion years ago. But I just tagged him in it, and I, had intentions of following up. And he actually messaged me yesterday and said, hey, I saw that thing, Gather 25. Can you tell me a little bit more about it other than just what's said in that video? And so I was like, send me your email. And then if we want to have like a little Zoom call or whatever, like I would love to connect. And so he sent me his info, and we're going to get together. And I'm just really excited to spread the word and try to help as many people have awareness to gathering and actually gathering with us on March 1st of 2025. So that was my bright spot.
Yeah, I mean, that's an incredible bright spot. And it's just one of those things that, like, every time I'm with someone that I'm mentioning it to now,
yeah,
it's so important. Like, I was mentioning it to mission partners at church at our mission fair. And it was just like, do you guys know about this? Hey, this is a really awesome opportunity. And so I was talking with one of our friends, Amy, and she was like, yeah, I'm going to be in Liberia for it. And I'm like, that's incredible. She was there at IF with us. And even that day when they made the announcement, she was like, I have to be in Liberia for this. They have to be able to do this. And we were like, they will. God will make a way.
Yep.
So good. So good to have you here today, Twila. And thank you for this midday pickup. And I hope that whenever our listeners are listening to this, that it will be a pickup for them as well, that they will be encouraged and inspired. Highlight those names, ladies and men, and just remember that everybody has a seat at the King's table. Until next time, keep following the table flipper and leave the table flipping to Jesus.